Waiting for there it goes. Okay. So welcome back to 12 Ordinary Men. We're going to be doing Philip today, the bean counter. As you guys all know, the first question of the whole thing is, what do you guys think about this week's reading? Thoughts? Who wants to go first?
I will. So I thought it was interesting how, and I don't know, I lost my book. Here's my book. Let me get it. I thought it was interesting how it talked about his characteristics and how I associated him with several rules followers that I know now. One that is going to smile at me here in a second. Or wave at everybody. And Jim too. But anyway, how interesting that he couldn't see his faith or experience his faith because he couldn't get past the black and white and the rules and just everything. You know, he couldn't do that. And I find that true of a lot of us a lot of times when we know to have the faith to know when Jesus is coming or around or doing something or intervening. But if it's not supposed to be working that way, well, then the rules kind of get in the way.
In defense of bean counters, I was thinking, what an uninteresting story this would have been if it weren't for Philip. I mean, the math had gotten him through on so many different cases. I mean, he probably was the one who decided what they could afford to have for lunch as a group, because he'd do the math and he'd work it out to see what actually was possible without any miracles, you know. And so just think it kind of bounded the problem so that Jesus had an opportunity to do his thing.
Agree on both sides. Anybody next? Want to volunteer?
I'll go. So when I was reading, one line struck me, and then I had to think about it, and I think I kind of found the answer later. He is unique among all the disciples. I think they're all pretty unique, but they're also all an awful lot like us. I'm finding a lot of me in every one of these people. But he was predisposed to be a pragmatist and a cynic and sometimes a defeatist rather than a visionary. I kind of thought of doubting Thomas when I heard that. But the thing that really struck me was, and I think this is the answer to the uniqueness, is he was the first that Jesus sought out and called. And he pretty much, I don't want to say blindly, but when John the Baptist said, "This is the guy," he said, "Okay." It was like, "This is what I've been looking for." And every time I heard him say, "This is what I've been looking for," and I'm paraphrasing, it was like, "No, you don't know. This is the beginning. It's not what you found." So that's what I got about Philip.
In my next slide, I actually have it written down that he's the first one that Jesus actually says the words, "Follow me," which is a huge thing. So yeah, I agree. Anybody want to go next?
I can. Same as everybody else, you know, it's, you know, what caught my attention, and Philip was more like the organizer. He was kind of like the guy that, you know, went out and got everything together and, you know, and all of this stuff. And, you know, when it was time to feed the 5,000, he was the one that went, "Well, that's going to be impossible. We're never going to be able to do that. We don't have it," you know, and all of this stuff. And, you know, and then Jesus kind of reprimands him like, "Oh, you know, you don't know do you not know who I am? It'll take care of itself. And so I saw a lot of myself in that, because you're constantly, I think women, as mothers, you're organizing and getting everybody going and all of that stuff. And sometimes you are pragmatic, because it's like, oh gosh, how are we ever going to get through, this kid has to be over here and that kid has to be over there. How's it all going to be organized? And yet it all gets done, and it's still, everything turns out fine. And sometimes you just have to sit back and go, it's okay to let it go. But so I saw a lot of myself in Philip.
I noticed there's a line in there how we were interviewing Philip for the job of being a disciple, how he would have been out because he didn't have enough faith, or he didn't have enough, I don't know, whatever it was that he didn't have, because he just wasn't enough. He was kind of slow to trust, slow to understand, slow to see beyond the immediate circumstances. But then Jesus says, he's exactly what I'm looking for. My strength is made perfect in weakness. And that's, so he kind of changed. He needed that person that was weaker I guess, in his thinking, but he still needed more proof. He was kind of a doubting Thomas instead of being Thomas, because he was not so sure about all this stuff going on. And I think I've seen that in myself. You're just not so sure that's going to work that way, but it ends up working. And that's what I think he did, a lot of that kind of second guessing or something. Dave, do you have anything?
Yeah, I thought the one thing I was thinking was that the author must have really disliked him, because he didn't have anything good to say about him, basically. And the other thing, I had a question. It said that the disciples were picked before the earth was formed. And I thought that as Lutherans, we didn't believe in predestination. So I wonder what the deal is there.
Pastor, you want to jump in on that?
Oh, I was going to see what you were going to say, Eric.
No, see, I delegate. That's
So what I'll say is, we don't believe in predestination, but we do know that God is at work in the world. And so when does God act in the world? Is it our time to determine? I think one of the things that he also noted in this chapter brings some light into this is, what is our perception of it? Are we perceiving it in God's time or our time? Is it our choice or is it God's choice? Who is that first mover? It's a tough one to wrestle with, and it depends on your perspective. For some of us, we like to feel like, I made a choice, I made a decision. Oftentimes people will talk about their baptismal day or their confirmation day or something along those lines. And yet, truly, when you were chosen was when Jesus was on the cross and he died for everyone.
And I'm going to remind everybody that the author is actually Catholic. So a lot of the Catholic beliefs will come out in his writings. So always remember that in the back of your head, that, yeah. Anybody else want to chime in? Okay.
I'll hop in, Eric. So the thing for me is, if y'all know me, I am not a bean counter at all. I'm the exact opposite of Philip. I see a vision and I just figure everything's going to fall in place. But the fact that Jesus sought him out first kind of reminds me that even Jesus wanted a bean counter there to help keep things together and to kind of administer the whole organization of the 12. And maybe that's something I really should kind of focus on and realize, that if Jesus needed one, I definitely would too. And not just kind of throw it all to the wind.
Could we add that after Jesus died, it was Philip who led multitudes to Christ. So as an independent leader, he excelled in that area.
Cheryl, you want to go?
Yeah, if I was doing the hiring for this bunch of people, men, I don't think I would have hired Philip. I mean, he's a pessimist, he's rigid, he's hard-headed, and he sounds like a pain in the neck to me. I would have said next. But my question was Jesus, do you think it was ever disappointed in Philip or in any of the disciples?
I don't think so.
No?
I think it's a learning process. He understood us, and he understood the path that we have to take to get to our understanding of what he was, and who he was. So no, I don't think that's why he was sent. He was sent to teach us. He was sent to get us to this unknowing place to a knowing place. And so, no, I don't think he was disappointed. He already knew that what those were going to happen. So
it kind of makes me think of like teaching school. You have this one kid who drives you crazy all year, but you have a lot of thinking that this kid's going to do okay because I can see this in him. This kid is going to be okay because he understands this part. He just is giving us a hard time for some other reason. And so I think that's what Jesus did. Since he was a teacher too, he looked at the inside. He didn't look at just what was going on when he said stuff and complained, oh, we can't do this. This is going to cost too much money, or this isn't going to work, or whatever. I think Jesus was being a teacher. He was really looking at what could happen.
putting down the foundations and watching it go, and knowing where it was going to go too. So I know Teresa Ward, you want to jump in?
I really don't have anything to add that everybody else hasn't already said. Pretty much the same things, so I'm good.
Cindy, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I have kind of a couple of things that hit me in this chapter. I will agree with with several of you made this comment. I thought the author was a little bit harsh on Philip. I don't know. In the very last part, it talks about a place where he said, well, show us the Father. And then he goes in to talk about how, Jesus had been explaining the Father and, that they were one. And I think, well, my goodness, that the Holy Spirit, Father, Son is a really hard to understand. And can you imagine at that point trying to understand that? I thought, well, why would you? That's just hard. That's just hard for people to understand. And at that point, it would have been even harder probably. And then there's something else that really hit me, and it's not really just about Philip. And I went back and reread this a couple times because it just resonated with me. On page, and it's resonated with me because of what we've gone through in the last 4 months. On page 120, they're talking about how after the resurrection, that many of them went back, and that at one point Peter said, and I had never read this before, but he says, I'm going fishing. And that kept going on in my mind because, okay, Jesus has died, he's gone, he's been buried, he's risen from the dead. And then I thought, of course they're going fishing. They're fishermen. That's what they do. And now Jesus is gone, and they go back to what they know and something to keep them busy. They have yet to know what they're going to do. And it made me think truly of the day Chris died, how we went back to his house, I watered his plants, and Rick pulled weeds in his garden. And it's just to keep busy. Engage your body to kind of get through it. And then I thought, how traumatic this must have been. I've never actually ever thought about this, but I thought how traumatic this must have been for the disciples. I mean, it's trauma. They lost the person they followed for 3 years, a person they loved. They gave up their families for. And then it just, I thought, and we don't feel that because it's so removed from us, but it just struck me. And I was like, of course they did. Of course they went fishing. They were traumatized. And it just struck me that way. And that was the part of the chapter that kept coming back to me about, and again, that's about all the disciples, not just Philip, but.
No, I think you make a great point. The fact that we forget after, the crucifixion that these 12 are completely frightened of their own lives. They feel lost. They feel abandoned. And as Cindy says, is they went back to what they knew. Old habits die hard. In that sense, they let go of all the teachings and said, "I'm going to go back to my work," and because it takes a reminder at times.
Well, and I think there's another aspect of that too. There's a connection there. As you were saying, you went to go water the plants and pull the weeds. The disciples were going back to the fishing that Jesus called them from. And so in many regards, they were going back to the place and saying, do you guys remember this day? Do you guys remember that time when that guy came and then called us to go do this? And what happened even just 3 years ago, how our lives have changed? And then they begin going back on that journey of, well, what are we going to do now? How do we move forward without him? And yet, has he really left us? What are we going to do now? I think you brought up a great connection there. They are going through trauma, as many of us do, as some of us are in right now. And yet we also bear witness to, in this book of faith, they did not turn away and say, well, we better go and do something completely different. We've got to go run the opposite direction. Instead, let's come back together and let's heal, but then let's get to work.
And something you mentioned in there just clicked in my head of, Jesus told them that they would be fishermen of men. Maybe they needed the reminder of what kind of fishermen they were at one point, that I am a fisherman. And yeah. Did I get everybody? I think so. Okay. If I didn't get you, please chime in.
Me.
Oh, all right. Come on in.
It's okay. I'm gathering data just like Philip. And thank you, Jim. Whatever. So yes, thank you, Lorraine. Yes, I am a lot like Philip. So I guess that's possibly why when Dave mentioned it, it's not that I was offended by this chapter. I thought the author took a lot of liberties and drew a lot of conclusions. Y'all are going to love this. That wasn't necessarily backed up in fact, or if it was, he didn't quote it. And so I am definitely one of those people. I don't believe, seeing is believing, right? Which is why my manager says she put me on the team, because I'm exactly the opposite of her. You need people like us who dig and root. And I think the whole time Philip was with Jesus, he was gathering those tidbits of facts that he needed. He had been with John the Baptist, so it wasn't surprising when he met Jesus, he knew who he was and followed him because he'd been gathering all of that data, probably since early times. It mentioned that Philip is a Greek name. For whatever reason, he kept his Greek name. The Bible left that with him and didn't change to whatever his name would have been, the non-Greek version. But he was also very well versed in the laws and the rules. He was one of those, good Jewish people, right? Followed all the rules and knew it. And I think for him that worked because he spent his whole life gathering tidbits that eventually he could use. He may not have known what they were for. So I guess for me, I kept thinking, well, why did we assume he saw the downside? He was a realist and was maybe trying to figure out a workaround, which I'm sure Jim and I do a lot at work. I'm always figuring a workaround to make something work. But I was like Dave, I thought the author took a whole lot. He made a lot of assumptions out of just a very few pieces of scripture, and then just one reference historically for how he died. So I found that unusual. Odd, maybe. I don't know. But.
So I agree completely with that. And so I kind of made a list. I actually struggled on this week on what to bring up and what to talk about because of that reason. Because this is a chapter where I think he's trying to make a point. And because he's trying to make a point, he references three little things and then establish it and just goes with it. So I kind of made a list, and this list is just things that we somewhat know about Philip. That he's the fifth name in all the lists of the apostles. And if you remember, I'm going to switch to the second, or my next slide real fast, just to mention this. Here's the structure of the 12 apostles. And because he's the top of the second group, he's actually a leader inside the group. He's considered the second leader of the second group. So when we see this and then we hear what he talked about, it struggled with me as well. And then I'm going to go back. So the other things is that he was born and probably raised where Andrew and Peter were. He was probably a fisherman. He kept his Greek name. He was most likely a co-worker or close friends before Jesus showed up with Andrew, Peter, Thomas, Nathaniel, James, and John as well. He's only mentioned in the Gospel of John. I thought that was interesting as well. And he was the first to be told, "Follow me," by Jesus. And then that he was an administrator. So some of the questions that I have in all that is, one of them was, why do you think he kept his Greek name? Or did it shock you that this is a Greek name and not a Jewish name? Because me growing up, I always heard, Philip, that's a Christian name, but it's actually a Greek name. So any thoughts on that?
Well, I didn't necessarily know it was Greek, but I don't speak Greek either. But no, I'm like you, I think, Eric. I just took it at face value that was just his name, the name when he was born. And they didn't reference it. I kind of wondered if maybe was his mother Greek, although Jewish culture, I think if the mom probably would have been Jewish and dad would have been Greek. I know I have a friend who kind of explained that to me. So perhaps someone he cared about, or his grandfather, maybe he was named after somebody that was important to him, but that's just kind of all conjecture.
You actually brought up a great point. In the Jewish history and belief, you have to be, the mother has to be Jewish for the kids to be Jewish. So you could have a father that wasn't Jewish and still the kids would be Jewish if the mother was. So it goes down the mother lineager of that. Any other thoughts about his name being Greek? Now, it does kind of explain in the book a little bit about that, of the Haitians. He would most likely been called a Haitian.
Hellenist.
Thank you. I don't know where I got Haitian.
Well, the people of Haiti are Haitian, but
that's probably what I was thinking about.
Well, they talk about that in the very beginning of the chapter, so I guess it didn't strike me as that odd if that were in fact true. So,
well, remember also the Greek came before the Romans, so it would have been years of culture coming in to this area, and then the switch and the downfall of the Greeks and the up reign of the Roman Empire. So I thought when I read that was one of the big interesting points, is like, oh, the Greek came and influenced. They didn't take over, they influenced, and they adapted with inside the culture. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And the thing, his name was actually lover of horses. So,
and I think this is I'll emphasize this just a little bit more, simply because the way we are looking at it, we've already known the story and we know the name Philip quite well, and we have always assumed it as a Christian name. And so this is also bringing into perspective of everyone else in that culture would have been like, huh, your name's Philip? So what's your Hebrew name? And we never actually hear it. In many regards, our Catholic brothers and sisters who will actually get a different name at your baptism. Yep. We do not practice that, but that is a common occurrence for many people, where you would have your cultural name, your name that you were born with, but then you would have your Christian name. And so this is something that is a little bit unique, because we have him as a Greek name, but he's Hebrew. He would have been in the Hebrew culture. He would have known it well, but maybe people might have been like, I'm sorry, how do you say your name? How do you spell your name? You would have been that kid growing up in class. Something just to think about when you're thinking about Philip.
I also saw something when I was doing extra research outside of this book, that most likely, because of his last name, he most likely spoke Greek as well, because of the heritage on that side, which I thought was interesting as well.
Well, spoiler alert, Matthew is referred once as Levi, which would have been the Hebrew name, but most people kind of think that the other gospels refer to him by Matthew, to try to separate that degenerate that nobody liked with the disciple later on. I don't know with Philip, but maybe that also is part of what plays, or it's just what he went by because of his family and heritage. So it's really hard to know.
Well, and I also think knowing about the Philip is his Greek name, and most likely had another, which is why we get so confused sometimes, going to the other slide again, of all the other names, that every single apostle gets named differently in different spots of the Bible. And, thanks that we have somebody out there that can look at it and refer to it and know that it's the same person. So my next question is,
I have a question. Before we get too far, again, my narrow field of understanding, do we know whether or not Philip, or in fact any of the other apostles, were not Jews?
I believe that they were all Jews. I remember reading that somewhere, that we're 100%. Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up from Pastor, so I'm going to feel more confident saying this.
Good. I learned that. And, he kept his name, possibly. Doesn't seem why he got it, but he preached extensively back in Greece. And he probably gained a greater acceptance not having a Hebrew name over there.
I've never even thought of it of after his teachings, or after him going, of keeping the name, and that makes a lot of sense.
The name, Jesus renamed a couple people. Maybe this one didn't need to be renamed because the mission he knew he was sending him on.
And kind of talking about how we had Peter that went to, I'm now blanking, the Gentiles, and worked with the Gentiles, and then we had James that went with the Jews and taught and was with the Jews a lot, and then now we have Philip that goes to Greece and works with, the people of the Greece. It's like Jesus knew exactly where and what group they needed to all go and talk to.
Well, and I'll add to that. I think, once again, as we're learning about the disciples, Jesus chose people from all different places and all different, I don't want to say cultures, but here is Philip, who's carrying a different name and a Greek name. And then you've got Matthew, who is the tax collector. I mean, he really made sure there was a representation of all different groups. And maybe it was because, like you said, Eric, he knew where they were going to go preach and what they needed.
So if Philip went to Greece, when Paul got there later on, were there already Christians in Greece?
I mean, I would assume it's spread. So yes, but also remember that in that time, that's when Christians were also starting to be hunted. So even though you could have a Christian neighbor, you might not have known it. And so the early church in that, and one of the things that I've been trying to do more research on is in the early church and how it spread. We lose a lot of it because of how secretive a lot of that was, as I understand it. Because one of the things that I've been really interested in trying to find out is all these really cool churches in weird places in the world. There's one in Africa that's literally dug into the ground of the rock. It's like, how did that get there? Why did it get there? Who brought it there? There's a great one in the mountains in the north hemisphere area. And so I've been trying to figure that whole thing out, which hopefully by the end of this I will. But that's kind of the thing that I'm trying to look at.
So
going back.
Oh, go ahead, Scott.
Going back to his name, remember that the Gospels were written much later. And if Philip went to the Greeks, spent the time teaching and preaching there, and then came back, he might have been referring to himself by Philip at that point. So the disciples wound up just kind of referring to him as, or thinking of him as Philip. Because, Eric, as you know, we have a friend that basically through middle school, high school, college, he went by like 3 or 4 different names, and you can tell when somebody met him by the name they refer to him as. So I could see Philip, and then he'll kind of correct them or say, no, I'm going by this name now, and then it kind of takes time to shift. But I could see where the Gospels refer to him as Philip, because after coming back from Greece, he thought of himself as Philip.
So I'll just say there's no record of that. And if there would have been something like that, they probably would have recorded it. So I'm looking at like Saul to Paul. So if there was a transition, or even like Simon Peter, where there was a change of names, then that would have been more reflected in the scriptures, because they would have made note of that. I think, Susan, one of the things I just want to highlight for you is keep in mind that they're probably very much overlapping, Paul and the disciples. So when Paul becomes converted to Christianity, many of the apostles are going, I don't know, do we trust the guy? I mean, remember, he was just going around asking where people were living, and he wanted to kind of kill us. Do we really want to trust him right now? And so many of them were trying to figure that out. And so there is some overlap. And some of our apostles actually go to churches that Paul started or others started, and kind of, for lack of a better term, they were preacher circuit riders, where they would go around to different churches on their missions, and as they would go and do teachings, to kind of, yeah, I agree with this person, or yeah, we agree with this, but we don't do this. Keep that in mind. Or they would correct through letters like we have with Paul. So there's a lot of, I'll say commonality, but there's also differences with these churches too.
So my next question is actually him being an administrator, and a structured man, we'll say it that way. And this is where I once again, I kind of disagree with the author of giving him a hard time with the feeding of the 5,000. Because most likely he's probably asked Philip, Jesus asked Philip time and time again. It's like, okay, what do we have? Can we do this? Jesus didn't make miracles every day. And so I kind of look, it frustrates me that the author just bashes him on this point. But I think there's a great learning point in that, in the fact of being more open and more open to God's love and acceptance and the miracles that can happen. So I guess my question is what do you think about his administration, and now knowing that there are different leadership roles within the apostles, and did you know that, or what do you think about that? I threw a lot of information at you. I'm sorry. I rambled.
Can you clarify that question a little bit?
So knowing that there are different leadership roles, for instance, we know that Judas was the treasurer, him being Philip, really looking at the administration of things. So going and getting housing, going and getting food. What are your thoughts on that? Was it shocking to find out that there are different roles besides just like Peter, the leadership guy, that it's an organized group?
So when I first read, oh, go ahead.
I always thought of all of them as, 12 guys that just like, I'm going back to my childhood stuff. 12 guys that Jesus called into the sandbox and said, hey, let's do this thing. And I never really thought about their individuality. They just all did the same thing. They went out and spread what Jesus gave them. But that's because I think, like my history with preachers, is up until about 10 years ago, I couldn't look at them, let alone talk to them. They were up on that pedestal. And so I never tried to dissect them and understand them. And this is just opening so many vistas for me to think about, like Saul to Paul and the bean counters, and I can't wait to hear about doubting Thomas. I mean, it's making them real people to me, that they all walk and talk, they get dirty, they wash their hands. Like you say, somebody's got to go find the food, somebody's got to go find a place to lay my head tonight. I never really thought about that, and this is really opening up doors for me.
So basically what you're saying is that Jesus had a very diverse group with diverse skills and diverse personalities. And I've noticed when I was putting together teams, I'd always like to have diversity in it. The better the diversity, I think, the more creative and the more the better the performance of the individual team.
I see Pastor unmuted. Oh, and Scott. Scott, sorry, you were covered.
Nathan, do you want to speak or me?
I'll just chime in and say, when I heard this, it was a reminder of it's like counsel. And for those of you who've ever been on counsel, when it goes from one person to another person, it's often well, this person did it this way, but you don't need to do it that way. If you don't want to, if that's not the way you would do that, it's like, okay, I got to know the role, but how I do the role is something different. But what Jesus was doing, though, is getting them together and saying, you guys will be able to accomplish more if you work together. But more often than not, we do think about it as Jesus being more like the mother hen, and all the disciples were like the little chicks following around going, so what are we going to do today? What are we going to do today, Jesus? Where are we going to eat? Where are we going to sleep? Does anyone know? And so that's what we typically will think of. But then this book is helping us see that, no, he wasn't just teaching them, he was training them. He was giving them some hands-on experience as to, okay, what are you going to do when people come to you and want a miracle performed? How will you decide that?
Scott, you want to chime in now?
I was just going to say that the first time I read this book, and realizing that all the disciples were so different, I wouldn't say shocked me, because it was more of that, well, duh moment. Childhood. I heard all the stories, I read all the parables. It was all focused on Jesus and not on the men who were around him and the ones who took the message out after. And it was from there that I was able to take it even to the next step and go, you know what? Jesus came to earth as a human being and lived life. So he, as a baby, he cried. He needed his diapers changed. He scraped his knee. He ran to mom asking for help, and realizing that my whole life I had literally put him on that pedestal and the disciples, and completely forgot the mortal side, the side that was human. And it made me appreciate just how much he did for us and what the disciples did for us. And it just makes sense that, yeah, they all had to be different so that we who are all different could look at them and go, got it, this is what I can do. There's a bean counter that can figure it out. There's a guy who sticks his foot in his mouth every single time he speaks. He can still do it.
I also think, kind of bringing up that point, that means everybody that we meet, no matter what, is that same mentality. It can be anybody, can be an amazing Christian, an amazing follower of Christ. It doesn't matter their background. It doesn't matter what they've done. It doesn't matter anything of that. With Christ, magical things can happen. And that's the thing that I get with Thomas on that. And the fact that he was also teaching them kind of how to run a really good church. He pointed those things that needed to be pointed because, hey, this is going to need to be looked at. And I can't do everything. I need somebody. Can you look at this? And when it doesn't happen, guess what? I'm going to step in and don't worry about it because I can do those miracles. So that's kind of how I've always looked at it. And then my next question, this one's kind of more of a thinking one. If you want to jump in, go for it. But why do you think it's only the Gospel of John that Philip is mentioned in? It was a question that I asked myself, so that's why I wrote it down. This is the thing that's been bugging me since the moment I've read this. So I want to know y'all.
I'd like to expand the question because I often thought we have 12 apostles. They all did very important stuff. Why don't we have 12 gospels?
I agree completely, and I think some of it got lost in history, but I don't know. I mean, that's something that I'm always curious about, and looking forward and trying to find more information and more history, or more, just so I can understand a little bit more of that time, or anything.
Can I ask a question? Is he the only disciple that is only mentioned in one chapter, or are there other ones as we get down to those that are further down the list? Or is he the sole one that's only listed in John? Or
Well, so he's listed technically in every single one on the list of the apostles. So every single one of them are listed in all of them, and in Acts, except Judas Iscariot in Acts. So we know that. As we go on to the apostles, it gets smaller and smaller information in the Bibles. So literally he'll write a full thing about one line on Thomas, or on, so that one time that apostle stands out, he's going to write about it and make a lesson on it. So no, he's not the only one. There's some that doesn't even get mentioned except in the list.
so he's not really, that in itself is not terribly unusual.
No. But I do find it interesting that John does bring him into his version of what he saw. So and knowing about John from last week, about love and kindness that we already learned about, I didn't know if there was any insight that you guys saw within that, that is kind of moving you, that because now we know about John, why he wrote about his friend Philip. And it is something to think about, and we can answer next week. It's the thing that's been bothering me since the moment I read this chapter is that.
I think you might have answered it, Eric. John learned the power of love and the need for it, of relationships with people, and you just said Philip was his friend. So John learned the importance of remembering who and kind of communicating it much more so than the other disciples. So maybe that's why he mentions these little moments and intimate moments between them more so.
So I'll just chime in here just a little bit, and I'll give you an answer. One of the main reasons that he is named in John is John was written not for the Jewish people, but for the Gentiles. And so by including the name Philip, it would have been a more familiar name instead of having Hebrew name, and everyone in the list of characters or people are all the Hebrews. So then it becomes the question of, oh, wait, there's a guy named Philip. I know a Philip. So all of a sudden it becomes someone familiar. It's someone close. And so John recognizes that too, where he's recognizing Philip's role as, don't want to say a lesser leader, but he's recognizing that even Jesus saw his potential, saw his ability, and had him use those gifts in such a way. And so John was one who kind of highlighted that as a means of, there wasn't an insignificant person in the group. But the others, their focus, the other gospel writers, their focus in writing it necessarily wasn't on that. John is one of those books that he has stories, he has other things that the other gospel writers did not have. And because of the way he wrote and the message he was trying to convey. Kimball, your question as to why didn't all the disciples have a gospel? I'll say not everyone's a writer. That not everyone was probably writing down Jesus said that, didn't he? We should write that down. Some of them, I'm not going to write it down. I'm going to go and share that message. I'm going to give that message to others so that they actually live it out. So their focus wasn't on the writing. And if Philip truly was the bean counter, I'm guessing he wouldn't have written a book per se. It may have been more of a list. And depending on the lists that we have or we kept in history, it may have been, well, what are we eating on Thursday? Thursday is tuna. On Saturday, we are going to have, we're fasting. So congratulations, we're doing that. It may not have been that exciting of a list. But it could have been something really interesting that someone out there might have been like, ooh, I wish we had that.
Well, I think also this is a great opportunity to share that the book of the Bible was voted on to come together as the Bible that we have. So there were other books that were implemented into this council that they debated, they talked about it, they prayed on it, and formed the Bible that we have today. And Pastor, because I always forget the name and I always say it wrong, what is the name of that the council that happened?
Oh boy.
Was that Nicaea?
It was after the Romans became Christians, and that's when all the teaching started coming out. The books of different groups started to come in, and they started reading them and deciding what was going to be in the Bible.
Yeah, I want to say it was one of the Nicaeas. Keeping in mind that those meetings just didn't happen in one day. Oftentimes they met over several years or months. So I didn't want to. Kimball, you had something more to say or add?
Just to comment on what you were saying, because I was kind of thinking about it after I spoke without thought before. A lot of people are leaders, and a lot of people are much happier as worker bees or working behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to go with the definition here. If I wrote a journal, that's pretty private. I can stay in the background. Mm-hmm. But if I wrote a book or a gospel, just a change in terminology, that's putting it out there. And that a lot of people are not leaders. They're not want to have that limelight. So they would have been more effective, but they might have been much more comfortable not doing that.
Right.
And I can see that.
And even some of the parts of the Bible, like Paul's letters, he didn't mean for them to be canonized throughout all the centuries. He wrote them for a specific congregation and people at a certain time, but we've held on to them because they do have good teaching for really all Christians.
So going to my second to last slide, I kind of already shown you this a couple times, because I do think now that we're moving into the fourth or the second group, it is important to remember kind of everything, because now we know a lot about Simon Peter, James, John, and Andrew, and the first three in that group are very, very similar. We're now learning about Philip, which is the leader of the second group, and the other one is that, was it kind of shocking that a lot of this first and second group knew each other before Jesus showed up? Was that an interesting fact to find out for any of y'all?
I thought it was very interesting that they all came from such a very, very small area. Because I would have thought Jesus went, I mean, he went all over the place, you know, but no, they came from a very, very small area.
On the contrary, I find it quite normal thinking to have picked people in a small location and built them because this grew outward. And he had everybody around him. Had he had them from a lot of far-flung places, it would have been harder to have them together to oversee as they started doing their teachings on his behalf. And when they got trained and placed because of their unique abilities, then they were able to go forth and spread the word and let it grow out, like Philip went to Greece.
It kind of reminds me of growing up in a small town. You kind of know everybody. My high school class was only 186, and some people around here had like thousands in their class. And so you knew everybody, who they were. You might not have known them personally, but you knew pretty much everybody there. And I think that's the small town thing that Jesus picked too, because they were all kind of knew each other, maybe not real well, but you know, they knew who they were. And so he was able to pick and choose that way.
186 people? That's huge.
Well, yeah, if you live in Nebraska, there's 12, right?
I had some friends that their graduating class was 6.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that too.
Luckily, they were valedictorian, though.
Well, that's
it makes it a lot easier to do that.
That's little farm towns. My town was a big city. It was 8,000. So, you know.
Well, it's a lot easier to become valedictorian when there's 6 people you're going against, or I'm sorry, 5 people you're going against.
Exactly.
Something that Kimball said that just hit me, and I'm kind of losing it, but the fact that they were all the 4 that we have already looked at, and I didn't think about this earlier, all were looking at John the Baptist first. So they were all already getting a strong foundation of faith, a strong foundation of understanding of Scripture, and prepared themselves for Christ. So knowing that is kind of a really cool thing. So yeah, and we're going to go to the last slide, and I'm going to ask one last question that nobody's going to answer because it's more to think about as we go. So once again, I've picked 2 words. The first word was structured, because I don't like bean counter. For those bean counters out there, structured people. So I think Philip was a very, very structured person, and that he needed to find flexibility. And flexibility within his faith, flexibility in seeing what's going on around him. So my last question is, what kind of flexibility, because we get structured in our lives all the time. So where's the flexibility that we need to have and think about personally? And then I will ask in the church, and then as a Christian whole of the world and our family as Christians. So that's kind of my last question, but that's more of homework. Yes, this Bible study gives you homework. But yeah, so that's the end. And knowing that time is kind of short, does anybody want to lead us in the Lord's Prayer? Or have any last thoughts? And we're going to Nathaniel next week, by the way.
Can I just kind of make an announcement to everybody? Or we could do the Lord's Prayer and then I could tell people about it. Would you, Eric, am I okay? Okay.
Go for it.
So I wanted to draw everybody's attention to something new that our church is doing. And it's popped up on Facebook again. Scott and Aaron Colwick are doing kind of a collaboration. It's an online Wednesday service, and it's not just for our youth. It is very good. Aaron gives a little message, and I don't know. Scott, I think I know he's assembles it. He picks some songs that go along with it. You can get to it from Facebook or YouTube. I watched it last week, listened to it. A good message, and kind of like a weekly little service to listen to. And on top of that, they've also put together a Spotify account, a playlist of different kinds of Christian music that you can jump on and listen. And it's called Grow in Confident Hope. Is that right? Did I say that right, Scott? Give me a thumbs up. Okay. Anyway, it's a plug for that. It's very good. And I have a feeling not a lot of people even know it's out there. So take a look, listen to it, okay?
There's something.
Eric, can I get you to go back like 2 slides?
Yeah.
And explain the symbols that are on there?
Oh, here? This one? Or,
one
sorry.
more back.
The symbol.
One more back. There you go. Yeah.
So Philip, through superstition, believed that he was crucified on what is called, no, I'm going to say this wrong, so I'm going to look it up. It's a T-shaped cross, which is also called, where's my other sheet? I wrote it down somewhere. It's the tall cross. Basically, it was a T-shaped cross. So that's one of his symbols, is the T-shape. The other one, because he is referred to in the feeding of the 5,000, is 2 loaves of breads and a basket. So that's the symbols that are up right here. It's his symbols. Yeah. Does anybody want to lead us in the Lord's Prayer for us?
I think the book did say that he was stoned.
Yeah.
That he was, pardon?
Stoned?
Stoned. Yeah, so he would have most likely been hung and then stoned to death after being
hung.
Nice.
So yeah, crucified, and then so he couldn't run, so he was tied. Well, does somebody want to lead us in the Lord's Prayer, or I can point somebody out? You know who I'm going to point out, Cindy.
I think we should make Pastor do it.
Okay, I will lead us in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not in temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you guys, and I'll see you guys next week. All my love.
Eric, Nathan, hang around for a second.